This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. So, have you heard the one about the man who finds himself in an apartment filled with thousands of comedy records? Well, you're about to. That may sound like the setup for a punchline, but it actually sets the stage for a collector's story that spotlights our culture's love of laughter. It's zeal for zaniness. It's Jones for jokes. Okay, I'll stop. And yes, this story does involve an apartment full of comedy records, the home of a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of the world of comedy is only rivaled by what's on his shelves. The collector in question is Jeff Abraham, and he's an entertainment publicist and author based in Los Angeles. Over the course of his career, Jeff has represented some of the biggest names in stand-up comedy, having handled publicity for the likes of George Carlin, Steve Harvey, Richard Lewis, Andrew Dice Clay, the Smothers Brothers, and many more big names. But well before he found himself working with comedians, he was idolizing them, coming of age when comedy was hitting new peaks thanks to TV's Saturday Night Live and big-selling live comedy albums by Steve Martin, Bill Cosby, and Richard Pryor. Jeff's fascination with comedy and the people who make us laugh led to him exploring the comedic stylings of everyone from the Marx Brothers to Lenny Bruce, from Woody Allen to Red Fox, largely through his interest in record collecting. Jeff began collecting comedy records as a child, and he really hasn't stopped, scouring record shops, eBay, and swap meets, and amassing a collection that ranges from well-known recordings to exceedingly rare, hard-to-find discs, including some that were never meant for public consumption. It's a collection that Jeff says amounts to about 5,000 records in all. And, in a For Keeps first, Jeff's collection actually grew during this podcaster's interview with him, precisely at the moment when his doorbell rang. What did we get?
My buddy and I stopped at 3 record stores in Buffalo, so I bought about 8 or 9 records on my trip. So new additions to the comedy archives.
There you go. The 5,000 albums, or should I say 5,009 albums in Jeff's collection, constitute most, but not all, of what he calls the Abraham Comedy Archives, much of which can be found in the home office in his LA apartment. His exhaustive archives include books, old advertisements featuring comedians, items from the Friars Club, New York's legendary gathering spot for comedians and other entertainers, and even framed proclamations that a host of old-time comedians received as honors from various civic organizations. Jeff's also got more than a few collectibles that commemorate his own personal king of comedy, the late, great Jerry Lewis. And, if his devotion to entertainment history isn't obvious enough, he's also the co-author of an intriguing book titled The Show Won't Go On, The Most Shocking, Bizarre, and Historic Deaths of Performers on Stage. Yep, when Jeff hasn't been savoring the history of popular entertainers killing on stage, he's been writing about some unfortunate ones dying there. More on that later. Though Jeff has lived in California for decades, he's originally from the New York City area, and he says he was the ideal age to embrace comedy as a kid growing up in the 1970s.
I'm 61 years old. I grew up in Levittown, Long Island, very middle America upbringing. Came out to California, Los Angeles with my family after the winter of 78, which is one of the worst winters ever. Go West, young man. But having been born in 1962, when Saturday Night Live premiered in 1975, I was 13. So I think I was the perfect age for that type of comedy. I think it was geared for maybe 13-year-old kids or teenagers. So I grew up on Saturday Night Live. It was at that time there was a Marx Brothers revival. You Bet Your Life was being seen for the first time in syndication. Animal Crackers, which of all their movies was never seen, was suppressed due to some rights. So that got a big international screening when that premiered for the first time. And then also the birth of HBO. Robert Klein's first HBO special was New Year's Eve, I believe, 1974. So all these were happening at the same time.
It was as a comedy-obsessed teen that Jeff began to build up a collection of comedy recordings, leading him on the path to a career in entertainment, just not as an entertainer.
I started to collect some comedy albums. I think one of the first was Groucho Marx, An Evening with Groucho Marx, supposedly his Carnegie Hall album, but it was really recorded at other places. And then I remember getting one of Woody Allen's double stand-up LPs. I still have that. It was one of the first comedy albums I ever owned. And I got that in the drugstore. I mean, there really weren't records. Well, I lived on Long Island, so there really weren't records. There was no Tower Records there. So you went into your Walgreens or Corvettes or that, and they would have a record department. And I remember that I think my local drugstore had this double LP, the famous Moose routine, if you know your Woody Allen. So that's how I got into my world of comedy. At the same time, I was an amateur magician, but I had no talent. So being a professional magician wasn't going to last. But I love show business. I love stand-up. So I said, let me try stand-up. That lasted about 2 performances when I was in college in 1980 here in Northridge. And I said, wait, let me take my business sense, maybe become an agent, a manager. And I wound up studying marketing in college, and I became an entertainment publicist representing comedians. And there we are.
I think it's interesting. You were growing up in the late 70s, and you had like Bill Cosby and Steve Martin and all these big names putting out big comedy albums, and you were going for the Groucho Marx and sort of the older stuff at first.
I certainly remember, Steve Martin, doing King Tut and premiering on Saturday Night Live. Cosby, I certainly remember him as a gym teacher, Chet Kincaid. Yeah, and I probably had, Why Is There Air is one of my first comedy albums. And, it's funny, someone just made a list, I think it was the AV Club, of the 40 greatest comedy albums. And noticeably, there were no Woody Allen and no Bill Cosby albums on that list for obvious reasons, which is so ridiculous. I'm sorry, they are still very funny, and I will defend those to that day. That's a whole nother discussion. But yeah, no, I definitely enjoyed that. I remember seeing The Jerk, what year that was. I was, again, probably 16 years old, and yeah.
So when you began collecting, was it as easy to find comedy albums as it was to buy, say, an Elton John album or whatever?
I was not buying, old stuff. I would, like I said, you could go into a drugstore and buy what was ever the current album. Yeah. So because that Woody Allen was a current album, it was easy to get. I mean, obviously you always have to say there was no eBay back then. And also, I was not thinking of old albums. There were old-time radio shows, so you could go out and buy, for $3.99 a You Bet Your Life episode or an episode of the Jack Benny Show on LP. So there were companies like Radiola and Sandy Hook who reissued old-time radio shows. It wasn't until much later, buying 3 old records became 4, and that became 10, became 20, became an archive. Yeah, but no, I was buying what was convenient. Again, it was very easy to go into a bookstore as a kid, and there were, say, 3 Marx Brothers books out on the table. And there was a Murray Hill was a catalog. They did a lot of nostalgia. And they would always, like I said, stock old-time radio shows, and you could buy those on cassette or LP.
So at what point did you begin seeking out the more rare recordings?
I guess, before eBay, I remember going to paper shows, not buying so much albums and things of that. They didn't always have, but you could find nice ephemera, ads for, Groucho Marx for Smirnoff vodka, Groucho Marx for Dutch Master cigars. So I do remember going to paper shows. But I will say, going back in Long Island, we did have 1 or 2, movie collectible stores that sold old-time movie stills and posters. So, again, I didn't really have to search that far to find old stuff. But also, you could go into a store like Oz, if those Spencer Gifts, and they had Marx Brothers posters. So, slowly but surely, I would find them. I would go to the older stores and find original stuff as opposed to the current items being marketed. And then at some point, I wish I could say, I'm going to become a collector. It just, again, 3 Marx Brothers books wasn't enough. I needed to have a 4th. Now let me get a couple of Laurel and Hardy books. Let me get a couple of Abbott and Costello books. And then it just became, I call it an archive because it's an amazing resource that I have of material. I have very often scholars that will come to me and say, I need this album for a project. Do you have a book? Do you have a recording of this and that? So it is a very well organized collection of material.
To build that collection, Jeff has spent a lot of time at swap meets, and his persistent presence at them has led to him unearthing some exceedingly rare finds.
Luckily, we have the Pasadena Record Swap Meet, and the first Sunday of every month for 25 years, I've been going there looking for a comedy album. And after a while, you become that guy. People go, hey, Mr. Comedy, I have something here for you. So about a month ago or so, I was at the Pasadena Swap Meet, and the guy goes, hey, Mr. Comedy, I got something here for you. I got 2 records. They're not marked. I don't know what they are. There's 2 guys doing like a Bob and Ray routine. And another guy, it sounds like Stan Freberg. I don't know. You want him? He wants $20 for him. Well, I don't know what they are. It could be some local disc jockey. So I bargained him down for $15. I took home the records, the 2-man group. Within about 10 seconds, I said, this sounds like a young Bob Newhart. Within 15 seconds, this is definitely a young Bob Newhart before he was the Bob Newhart of the Button-Down Mind. Bob was a radio disc jockey in Chicago, and he had a partner. And they said we were a poor man's Bob and Ray trying to do a syndicated radio show. And he said we were like in Vermont, Chicago, and like West Virginia, nationally syndicated. And that's what one of those recordings was.
How did you verify that?
One, by listening to it. Within 10 seconds, I knew it. I knew my Bob Newhart history, that he did this act, and then doing some Googling search and pulling out a book. I said, that's exactly what's on the record. And the other album said, that definitely sounds like Freberg. And it was a radio commercial. It was an unknown hairspray company, like an Aquanut, but not that. And I Googled it. It was a real product. It was a Stan Freberg commercial I had never heard before.
How many times have you said to yourself, I wonder where I can buy show curl hairspray?
Never. I have never said that to myself.
I beg your pardon?
I never even heard of it.
Well, it's one of the top hairsprays out in Hollywood, but it's just being introduced here.
Well, then, be reasonable. If I never heard of it yet, how could I have wondered where to buy it?
And just so I'm clear, at swap meets, you're not literally swapping records, right?
No. It's funny. They call them swap meets or flea markets, and you're not buying fleas either. No, the Pasadena swap meet is, for your listeners, is like the Rose Bowl, which everybody has in their big city, where people bring their junk. I think George Wallace, the comedian, used to make a joke. He says, I will tell you something if you tell me what white people get up early in the morning and sell all their garbage on their front lawn, garage sales. Yeah. So they're big garage sales, and it's everybody you have dealers who sell, merchandise they buy in bulk, to people buying old antiques. And if you're ever looking for a rusty spoon, that's a good place. And my game I always do when I go to the swap meets, I can't leave without seeing a bad clown painting.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so it's something that looks like something that John Wayne Gacy did.
It was in the collegial atmosphere of a swap meet where Jeff scored one of the standout pieces in his audio archive, an unreleased recording featuring the stars of one of TV's most iconic comedies.
One guy had a bunch of acetates. Those are records before they became the final pressing. And he had one that said Lucy Desi on it. And there was a very famous testimonial dinner for Lucy and Desi that the Friars put on. And it's become quite infamous because Albert Brooks's father was a radio comedian named Harry Einstein Parthiokarkis. He was a Greek dialectician. And Albert Brooks's real name is Albert Einstein. And it's famous because his father died during that performance. Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty legendary. In fact, before eBay, you would see these records they're not, I wouldn't say rare, but they're kind of hard to find. So in the early days of eBay, I had one and I met Albert and I said, hey, I have this rare record. Do you have it? So I supplied Albert with an extra copy, just for my cost, So anyway, this guy has this acetate. So I figure it's going to be just another copy of the Lucy Desi dinner. And another guy happened to have a turntable. And I said, let me borrow these acetates, take them to this guy, and I will identify them. So he let me listen to it. And then again, within about 10 seconds, I go, this is not the Lucy Desi testimonial. This is something else. And it turns out when Oppenheimer, not the famous bomb Oppenheimer, but Jess Oppenheimer, who created I Love Lucy, left CBS to go to NBC. He was offered a contract to leave. And they threw a party for him at his house. And Lucy, Desi, Vivian Vance, and William Frawley all did these sketches and song parodies. And this was a recording of that party.
Oh, my God.
And this was a record of maybe they made a dozen copies for people.
Wow.
So, that's a kind of holy grail that I have in my collection. I mean, you can put that on a want list. You're never going to find another copy.
Any idea how it got to wherever it was where you got it?
Yeah, well, here, the nice thing is here in Southern California is, you have retired people who sell their collection, So, Oppenheimer may have given it to a friend and that friend dies and goes in a record collection here in Southern California. The chances of that record showing up in Iowa are probably 1,000,000 to 1. But in Southern California, your chances are better. It might be 1,000 to 1.
Other rarities in Jeff's archives include a record by stand-up's original Bad Boy, as well as one from comedy's mustachioed megastar.
Lenny Bruce had done a privately pressed record, and then it later was reissued by Phil Spector on his Phillies label. But the first batch of records were on Lenny's own label, and they have his own address, and it was sold for $5. So I managed to pick up a couple of those. So that's a neat treat. Those are kind of rare. Groucho Marx did a special record for DeSoto when he was on You Bet Your Life.
Beauty doesn't always mean quality. That's true of women and certainly true of cars. Looks can be deceiving, but here's one car that has as much quality as it has beauty. The magnificent new 58 DeSoto. It has what we call the look and feel of the future.
Those are rare, maybe in eBay you see 3 for over 10, 15 years. And I have a lot of I love testimonial dinners and fryers, and I have a couple of oddball testimonial dinners that are, again, those were usually sold for the people who attended. So maybe they made 75 of them in 1959. Fast forward 2023, how many have survived? People moving, thrown out. It's either somebody will put it in the heap with the other stuff for $1, or some guy go, oh my God, look at this. This is a rare thing. I want $500. And then you go back on eBay 2 years later, it's still sitting there for $500. Really? What are you thinking?
So estate sales are your friend generally?
Yeah. I've done well at estate sales. Yeah. You go to, here in, Southern California, we've had estate sales for Rose Marie, Mike Connors, Gary Owens, and then people you have who are not celebrities, right? Some people, they're just people with big collections who accumulate. I mean, if I had an estate sale for my collection, you would find some pretty good things here. But that's not happening for a while.
Let's hope not. I keep thinking about Albert Brooks wanting that recording of his father dying. I mean, was there any hesitation on his part to have that?
No. It's funny. If you ask, Albert's brother is Super Dave Osborne, the late Bob Einstein. And people would say, oh my God, your dad died on stage. How great is that? And Dave would say, what does your mother do for a living? Oh, she's a housewife. Well, what if I came over to your home while she was making eggs and hit her over the head with a frying pan? Would you say she died doing what she loved, cooking eggs? So that was his morbid take on it.
Yeah.
Albert said, isn't it amazing what my dad did? He didn't die in the middle of his performance. He took a bow, got the last laugh. He put his head down and he died. How great is that? He went out with laughter in his, And fast forward years later, I came out with a book called The Show Won't Go On about performers who died on stage. Literally. And we didn't do stuntmen who were as an occupational hazard of dying on stage, or an athlete, like a boxer who may be punched. We did people who accidentally died on stage, suffering a heart attack in mid-performance. And obviously there are a great number of comedians. And I always tell people my advice, if you're going to die on stage, try not to be a comedian. Most people will think it's part of your show and your act, and they will not take you seriously. It's my giveaway advice from the book, when reading the book.
And you're a professional, so...
Yes, I am a professional. I do say my writing partner, a gentleman named Bert Kearns, and I always said if anyone found our emails, I'm going to have to answer those years later. When Steven Tyler collapsed on stage or Meatloaf collapsed on stage, we would send a note to each other. Hey, do you think he'll make chapter 7? So, a little more of it humor when doing a book on death on stage.
Sounds like it. So how do you organize your collection? Do you have a written inventory of everything to keep it all straight?
I did at one point, but I'm so far behind. At one point, I did sit down and I didn't have a fancy spreadsheet, just an alphabetical listing. So starting with A, Bud Abbott, or Abbott Costello, go to Y and Z, Henny Youngman and comedian Bob Zaney. Now, the shelves were filled from A to Z, and that was 20 years ago. I said, 20 years ago, I moved into this place. I had 1,500 records. Now, 20 years later, I'm in the same place. Now I probably have 4,500, 5,000 records. So obviously, you have to take things out of shelves and move it, and you have other places. So they can't all be in alphabetical order. So I have an overflow and an overflow. So somebody did put out a book by Goldmine, which was a record collector's publication called The Guide to Comedy Records. Not obviously every comedy record, but a pretty good comprehensive guide. So it was very good when people like Red Fox had 42 albums out, and I had 38 of them. And I had a copy that I carried at the swap meet, and I would cross it out and know, I'm missing those 3. So I do have things, but no, very often I will get home from the swap meet and go, oh, shoot, I have this already. And I go to file it away, and I go, whoops, I don't have that.
Yeah. And a natural follow-up question, have you digitized all or even some of it?
That you can't, the problem with digitizing, it's all would have to be done in real time. So a 40-minute album will take you 40 minutes, and probably even longer to queue it up and this and that. But I can do things on demand. Like if you called me up and said, I'm doing a project on Steve Martin. Can I get a digital copy of his first couple of albums? They may not be on CD. That's a bad example, but someone really obscure. So yes, I can digitize something. I have the software to do that.
Uh-huh. And is it only records, or do you have tapes and CDs as well?
Yeah, I have CDs. Generally, if I'm getting a CD, it's either because it's an artist who previously wasn't on LP, so it would be a newer artist, or if they reissued it with bonus material like that. If you looked at my computer, I have hundreds and hundreds of MP3s that I will trade with people. But no, if you look also in the back of the archives here, there's thousands of VHS cassettes. Over the years, I've added DVDs, but a lot of, HBO specials have not been put out on DVD, and they're not streaming anywhere. So I do have a lot of those kind of things that are obscure collections.
And then there's Jeff's favorite comic performer of all time, Jerry Lewis. Jeff's appreciation for Lewis, both as an actor and as half of the legendary comedy duo he starred in with Dean Martin, has led him to seek out some interesting collectibles.
So I do have some really nice Jerry Lewis items. Everything from Jerry Lewis cufflinks. Jerry Lewis used to give out lighters. That was the day when you gave gifts to people. Jerry would work a theater, and at the end of the week, he would give everybody from the key grip to the stagehands, the lighting guy, thanks from Jerry Lewis. So all these monogram lighters. So again, before eBay, if you went to a show, you got it. But now you go on eBay, you type in Jerry Lewis lighter. There's 15 different lighters, different colors, sizes, and some are $5 and some are $25 and some might be $150, but it comes with the original box and said my uncle got it in 1959. So I do have that. And even a little more collectible than Jerry Lewis is Martin and Lewis, because they were only together for 10 years. And really the merchandising was probably only maybe 6 of those years. So, a Martin and Lewis lighter is certainly much more collectible than a Jerry Lewis lighter. And Martin Lewis matches. I did find a sealed set of Martin Lewis playing cards and came in. They would give gifts to people.
But Jeff's given plenty of Jerry Lewis gifts to himself over the years. Take the time he was having lunch at a famous Jewish deli in L.A. and got a fateful phone call.
I'm at Cantor's Deli with a friend of mine, and there's an auction going on. There was a former NBA coach who had a collection of Jerry Lewis material. He had passed away. And this was an auction happening in Virginia. It wasn't, Sotheby's or one of the bigger ones. I happened to stumble upon it. So there I am having the pastrami sandwich, probably the Eddie Cantor or the Ben Blue sandwich, some nostalgia Jewish sandwich. And I said, hold on a minute, I got a bid. 80, 70. All right, I'll bid $85 on that Martin and Lewis money clip. Okay, no, I'll take that tie tack. And ironically, the next day, Jerry Lewis died.
Wow.
So obviously, things fluctuate. Sometimes that $85 item next day can go up to $250, and then sometimes the market, as more and more show up and everyone has them, that $250 item may now settle down to $150.
Jeff is also a frequent attendee at celebrity estate auctions, which he says can be like visiting a museum dedicated to the history of the departed. It was through his connections to the estate world that he acquired still more Jerry Lewis collectibles.
So a friend of mine who deals with a lot of auction houses said, you're going to want to get yourself to Vegas. I can't tell you why, but you're going to want to go to Vegas. I eventually found out the Jerry Lewis estate auction. So a buddy of mine, we drove to Vegas to go to the Jerry Lewis estate sale. And it was like going to a Jerry Lewis museum. There was Professor Kelp's Nutty Professor costume. There was this, there was that, and every item came from Jerry Lewis's house, bound scripts, photo albums. The one thing I was surprised that he had a pretty good gun collection. The first 75 items in the auction were Jerry Lewis's gun collection. Man had an arsenal, and it was in chronological order. So lot 42, a Luger. Lot 79, a Smith & Wesson, a Mark Super Jew in the handle. All right, can we get to the funny stuff? So I treated myself to a pair of Jerry Lewis's trademark glasses. I paid about $600, with buyer's premium, whatever it was, But when I met Jerry Lewis at his home, he was wearing those glasses, and I know people in Jerry's camp. And one person said, yeah, Jerry had those on his nightstand. That's his pair. And another person who worked on his telethon as his stage manager said, yeah, I remember putting those glasses by the podium. Little did I know that Jerry Lewis, a guy who's going to have 75 guns, is probably going to have one more glasses. So obviously you don't put multiple pairs of things in the same auction because it defeats the value. So they had another auction years later, and they had two pairs of glasses. Then I go, all right.
Another part of Jeff's comedy archive consists of proclamations and other awards that comedians have received over the years. One big comedy name whose awards can now be found in Jeff's apartment is Uncle Milty.
The other person who I love is Milton Berle. So I have various awards. One thing I started collecting proclamations of Jewish comedians from Jewish fraternal organizations. The B'nai B'rith Man of the Year Award. And they, every comedian got, you can't imagine how many of those. So I have outside of my office here, I have a hall of awards of great Jewish plaques. So in that wall of fame, I have a Jan Murray, George Jessel, who's one of my favorite comedians. At one point, somebody must have opened a storage locker and had hundreds of George Jessel plaques on eBay. And trust me, it's not like everybody was going there. This is a very obscure Jewish comedian. This is the guy who was supposed to be the original jazz singer, but turned down the part, and Al Jolson got it, and the rest is history. I could have done my entire house in Jessel, but at $25 a plaque, I got a few of them. So I have that. I have the big thing was they said we would plant a tree for you in Israel. I have a Sophie Tucker Forest plaque. And then somebody did that with Danny Thomas. And Danny Thomas is the honorary Jew on the wall because he's Lebanese, so he's on that.
I was going to say, the outlier. Yeah. While many big and instantly recognizable names are well represented in Jeff's collections, there's one comedy act in there that may not ring many bells with casual fans of comedy. But it's an act that's receiving plenty of attention from Jeff, and with good reason.
I'm working on a book on a comedy team known as the Rich Brothers, which is a very obscure team. There were three brothers that started in 1925 and went to 1979, so 54 years. One of the longest comedy teams. There was three of them for 40 years, from 25 to 65, and then the two brothers, Harry and Jimmy, for the last 14 years. But what makes them very special to us comedy historians and nerds, that Harry Ritz has been cited by my idol, Jerry Lewis, Mel Brooks, Sid Caesar, among others, as one of the most influential comedians of our time. Many of the crazy physical shtick, as they say, of those aforementioned comedians, Sid Caesar's double talk, Jerry Lewis mugging, Mel Brooks is mugging, the walking on the ankles that Milton Berle would do, wearing drag. Harry Ritz did this. I mean, there's a episode there. They did a all-star review in 1952, kind of like a Colgate Comedy Hour. And it's basically their nightclub act. And you watch that and you go, oh my God, that's Jerry Lewis's father. You go, oh my, I see it, When we talk about the great nightclub comedians of the 50s, Jimmy Durante and Sophie Tucker and Milton Berle, they're part of the group of live performers, people that would play. I mean, they played Vegas in 1946. I mean, they were playing the Latin Port and the Chez Paris, when they would do for 6 weeks, 3 shows a night. So because I'm writing this book, over the years, I've accumulated, posters, autographs, some signed documents, and hundreds of stills and ephemera, postcards and things like that. This was nice. So I have, as you can imagine, a pretty good assortment of rare publicity photos, publicity photos signed by the Rich Brothers. The nice thing is, if you're going to collect anything, this is a little tip for your guys, for all your listeners out there, collect somebody nobody cares about. It will be a lot cheaper. You don't have competition, and it won't be that expensive. So I have a lot of Rich Brothers 8x10s for that reason. They're fairly reasonable. I'm looking at this photo, though. Do I need another one? And I kept on looking at the inscription, and I think on the 15th time, and I realized who it was made out to. It was made out to Jerry, Patty, and Gary. That would be Jerry Lewis, his wife Patty, and Gary Lewis of the Playboys. At one point, Jerry's kids, I think, got into his storage bin and I think borrowed some items. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah. It all comes full circle, too, for you.
Yeah, and now it's in my home.
So, of course, we learned, if nothing else, from Albert Brooks' dad, that nobody lives forever. So I'm wondering, with the archives and the future, do you think about maybe donating it at some point to a museum or library or some other research entity?
I thought about donating all my books to the School for the Blind. 1, 2, 3. Took a minute.
Yeah.
Thankfully, there's a wonderful place now in Jamestown, New York, which I'm an advisory board member, called the National Comedy Center. Lucille Ball is from Jamestown, New York, and they created a $50 million museum celebrating all comedy. I mean, it's, they call it the Cooperstown of comedy, the Rock Hall of comedy. It's amazing. And what happened was Kelly Carlin, daughter of George, who I again represented, had heard about this place. Everybody has this vision. I want my material to go to the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress. But then if you've ever seen the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they pushed the Covenant into this giant warehouse, they closed the doors and will never be seen again. And Kelly had that fear that her dad's stuff, pun intended, will not be seen. And said, you know what? I think these people at the National Comedy Center may pull it off. So she made the donation. And ever since then, the National Comedy Center really started to gather attention. This was a couple of years before they had a building and a museum. So over the years, they've received the archives of Rose Marie, Shelley Berman. Carl Reiner just donated his amazing archives. There's stuff from Ernie Kovacs and on and on and on. So that is one place I've talked about. There's also a wonderful gentleman named Michael Feinstein, the great singer and music historian who is the keeper of the American Songbook. And since many of the comedians in the collection go back to vaudeville and they were on, did Broadway shows, it's not that far unrelated to the two. To have, if you're celebrating Fred Astaire, well, Bob Hope, was a vaudeville and he played Broadway and he played nightclubs. And he had a recording career. So that could be a possible home if somebody wanted this stuff. And the last place, maybe the Basketball Hall of Fame, just because it sounds funny. See, you're laughing.
Sure.
Everybody, has that dream that their collection will be kept. But, most times when you give something to an archive, you got to give money for them to catalog it, because otherwise it will sit in boxes. And if they already have some of the material, they have the right to sell it, So.
Take my stuff, please.
Yeah. So I like that. I'm going to use that. So it's something I'm thinking of. I have an estate set up, and I've been keeping notes and things of that, making a note. By the way, some of those albums could actually be worth $50 because they were signed. Again, it was a rare copy of an album. So I do kind of have that kind of a list set up.
Sure. So one last question for you. In recent years, vinyl records have made a tremendous comeback. Do you think that the heyday of the physical comedy album could make a similar comeback sometime soon?
Well, we have seen certain artists coming out with special reissues. I mean, it's amazing that somebody will reissue an Eddie Murphy album that I could probably go to a used record store and get a copy for $4, and somebody's making a brand new copy for $22, which makes no sense. Now, if you want to reissue something on vinyl for the first time that was only a CD issue, then that can be intriguing. And there have been special issues for Jonathan Winters and Lenny Bruce. However, there's this label out of Minneapolis called Stand Up Records, where they took some Richard Pryor albums that only had a digital component, and for people who wanted vinyl, issued it on LP. Or they took an album that the original album was only on LP, but the bonus material was reissued only on CD. So now it's a multiple LP set, all on vinyl, and Stand Up Records out of Minneapolis. So we are seeing more and more comedy albums coming out on vinyl. Yeah.
How about current comedians, for lack of a better word? Like, would John Mulaney do a vinyl album? Maybe he has.
Yeah, some of them will. They will do for Record Store Day and things of that nature. Patton Oswalt did an album that was only on vinyl. So, yeah, some of the new artists will do that. I think it's easier to sell something on CD if you're selling merch versus a big album.
Uh-huh. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me about your incredible collection of comedy albums and beyond, and those Jerry Lewis keepsakes as well. This has really been fun.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure to share my stuff.
Yeah.
I'm glad I was able to share it with you.
Perfect.
All right, boss.
All right. Thanks again.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, the curtain is clearly not coming down anytime soon on Jeff Abraham's reverence for comedy history. In fact, he's currently handling publicity for another longtime comedy veteran, producer George Schlatter, who created the classic TV show Laugh-In, and now, in his 90s, has just published a memoir. And in Jeff's free time, it's a safe bet that he's combing through the records at an LA swap meet, hoping that sellers have put aside a comedic treasure or two for the man they rightfully call Mr. Comedy. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkowski. My thanks to Jeff Abraham for helping us peek into the comedy archives found in his home. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll see photos of Jeff and some of the standout pieces from his collection. And in the show notes, you'll find a link to the book The Show Won't Go On, The Most Shocking, Bizarre, and Historic Deaths of Performers on Stage, which Jeff co-wrote with Bert Kearns. The show's theme song is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was by Track Tribe and Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on.